I still remember the exact moment. My mother-in-law looked me in the eyes and said those words. He'll die broke. The room went silent. What hurt even more was seeing my wife sit there and say absolutely nothing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. They simply stared at me, waiting to see how I would react. I wish I could tell you that I stood up and delivered some brilliant comeback. I wish I could tell you that I embarrassed her the way she had embarrassed me, but I didn't. I just sat there, feeling every pair of eyes in that dining room burning into my skin. And in that moment I realized something. The most painful betrayals don't come from your enemies. They come from the people who are supposed to stand beside you. My name is Nathan Cole, and for 3 years I tried everything to prove I was worthy of my wife. 3 years. 3 years of working overtime. 3 years of sacrificing sleep. 3 years of hearing people tell me I wasn't enough. And somehow it still wasn't enough. When I met my wife Angela, I was 28 years old. I wasn't rich. I wasn't connected. I didn't come from old money. I was just a hard-working man trying to build a future. Angela never seemed to care about any of that. She loved my ambition. She loved my determination. She said she admired the fact that I was building something instead of inheriting it. At least that was what she told me. Back then I believed her. The problem wasn't Angela. The problem was her mother, Patricia Bennett. The kind of woman who judged people before they even opened their mouths. The kind of woman who believed a man's value could be measured by the car he drove. The kind of woman who looked at bank accounts before she looked at character. The first time I met her, I knew she didn't like me. I pulled up to Angela's parents' house in a used sedan that had over 100,000 miles on it. I spent an hour cleaning it beforehand. I wanted to make a good impression. Instead, Patricia walked outside, looked at my car, then looked at me, and smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile people use when they think they're better than you. She shook my hand and said, "So this is him." Nothing else. Just those 4 words. But somehow they felt like an insult. Dinner that night was worse. Angela's father barely spoke. Patricia did enough talking for everyone. She asked where I worked, how much I earned, what neighborhood I lived in, how long I planned on staying at my current company. Every question felt less like curiosity and more like an interrogation. When I answered honestly, she would nod slowly, as if confirming her worst suspicions. On the drive home, Angela apologized. She said her mother could be difficult. She said not to take it personally. I tried. For her sake, I tried. But Patricia only became worse. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering, there was always something. If I got a promotion, she would ask why it took so long. If I bought something nice, she would ask if I could really afford it. If Angela complimented me, Patricia would immediately change the subject. It became a pattern, a predictable routine. And over time, I started noticing something else. Angela never challenged her. Never once. She would squeeze my hand under the table. She would tell me later that her mother was wrong. She would apologize in private. But in public, silence. Always silence. At first I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. Then we got married, and somehow things became even worse. Patricia treated our marriage like a mistake that needed correcting. Whenever she visited our apartment, she found something to criticize. The furniture, the kitchen, the neighborhood, the size of the bedroom. Nothing escaped her judgment. One afternoon she walked through our apartment and actually laughed. She stood in the middle of our living room and said, "My daughter deserves so much better than this." I remember standing there holding a box I had just carried upstairs. My hands were shaking, not from anger, from exhaustion. I had spent the entire week working extra shifts, trying to save money, trying to build a future, trying to give Angela a better life. And Patricia reduced all of it to a joke. I looked at my wife, waiting, hoping, praying she would finally say something. She didn't. She simply looked away. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, wondering why defending me seemed so difficult for everyone. Months turned into years. I kept working. I kept pushing. I kept believing things would eventually improve. Then came the family dinner that changed everything. It happened on a Saturday evening. Patricia was hosting a large gathering at her house. Relatives had traveled in from several states. The place was packed. Laughter echoed through every room. Music played softly in the background. On the surface, it looked like a happy family event. Underneath, it felt like a trap. The moment Angela and I arrived, I could feel the tension. Patricia greeted everyone warmly, everyone except me. I received the same cold smile she always gave, the same look of disappointment, the same expression that seemed to ask, "Why are you still here?" For most of the evening I kept my distance. I spoke politely. I helped carry food. I avoided conflict. I just wanted the night to end. Then someone asked a simple question. A cousin from out of town. He looked at me and said, "Nathan, what are you working on these days?" I answered honestly. I told him about the professional certifications I was studying for. I told him about my plans. I told him about the opportunities I was pursuing. Before I could finish, Patricia laughed. The entire table turned toward her. She took a sip of wine, then shook her head. "I've heard these plans before." A few people chuckled nervously. I felt my stomach tighten. Patricia wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair, looked directly at me, and said, "Nathan is always planning something." Another laugh. Louder this time. My face grew hot. I wanted to leave. I should have left. Instead, I stayed. Then came the sentence that changed my life. Patricia looked around the table, smiled, and said, "Let's be honest." The room became quieter. She pointed her glass toward me and spoke the words I will never forget. Hildi broke. Silence. Complete silence. Every conversation stopped. Every fork froze in midair. Every eye turned toward me. For a moment I honestly thought someone would object. Anyone. A cousin. An uncle. My father-in-law. Someone. Instead, nobody spoke. Then I looked at Angela, my wife, the woman I loved, the woman I had sacrificed for, the woman I had defended countless times. She lowered her eyes and said nothing. Nothing. Not one word. Not one objection. Not one defense. Nothing. That silence hit harder than the insult. Because insults come from people who don't love you. Silence comes from people who should. Something broke inside me that night. Not loudly. Not dramatically, quietly, like a rope snapping after years of strain. I sat there for another minute, maybe two. I honestly don't remember. Then I stood up. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody apologized. I walked out of the dining room, out of the house, into the cold night air, the sound of laughter slowly fading behind me. I stood beside my car staring at the sky, trying to calm down, trying to breathe, trying not to feel humiliated. A few minutes later, Angela came outside. She looked uncomfortable, guilty, ashamed, but not surprised. That hurt too, because it meant this wasn't shocking to her. It was normal. She said, "You know how my mother is?" I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked at her and said, "No." For the first time in years, I didn't stay quiet. "No, Angela, your mother isn't the problem anymore." She stared at me, confused. I felt tears threatening to appear, but I refused to let them. "The problem is that every time she humiliates me, you say nothing." Angela opened her mouth, then closed it. I could see she wanted to defend herself, but there was nothing left to say. The truth was standing between us, clear as daylight. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I didn't know exactly what came next. But, for the first time in years, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never allow anyone to decide my worth again. And before that year was over, I would make a decision that would change every part of my life forever. I drove for nearly 2 hours that night before I finally stopped. Not because I knew where I was going, because I was exhausted. The anger was still there. The humiliation was still there. But something else had appeared beside it. Clarity. For years I'd convinced myself that if I worked harder everything would improve. If I earned more money, if I got promoted, if I bought a better car, if I moved into a nicer home, then Patricia would finally respect me. That night I realized something. People who need you to prove your worth will never be satisfied by proof. They need you beneath them. That is how they feel important. Around midnight I parked near a lake outside the city. I sat there staring at the water, thinking about my marriage, thinking about Angela, thinking about everything I had ignored. The next morning she called, then called again, then again. I didn't answer, not because I hated her, because I needed silence, real silence. Not the kind she gave me when I needed support, the kind that allows a man to hear himself think. 3 days later, we met. A small coffee shop, nothing dramatic. No screaming, no accusations. Just two people sitting across from each other. Angela cried. She apologized. She admitted her mother had crossed the line. She said she never intended to hurt me. I believed her. The problem was that intentions no longer mattered. Results did. And the result was simple. Every time I needed her, she disappeared. Every time I stood alone, she stayed silent. I looked at her and said something I had never said before. I love you. Her eyes filled with hope. Then I continued, but I can't keep living like this. I watched her expression change. Slowly, painfully, she understood what I meant. Our marriage didn't end that day, but something inside it did. Over the following months, we tried counseling. We tried conversations. We tried compromises. Nothing worked. Too much damage had already been done. Eventually, we separated. Then came the divorce. The strange thing was that I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt empty. Like someone had spent years removing pieces of me without my noticing. The apartment felt larger after Angela left. Quieter too. The silence wasn't comforting. It was lonely. For several weeks I moved through life like a machine. Wake up. Work. Eat. Sleep. Repeat. Then one evening something happened. One found an old notebook. A notebook I had written in years earlier, back when I still believed anything was possible. Inside were goals, dreams, plans, ideas. One page caught my attention. At the top I had written, "Become a physician." I stared at those words for several minutes. I had completely forgotten about that dream. Life had gotten in the way. Bills, responsibilities, marriage, pressure. Little by little, I had buried it. That night I sat at my kitchen table until nearly dawn, thinking, planning, calculating. The dream seemed ridiculous. I was already in my 30s. Medical school would take years. The odds were terrible. Most people would have laughed. Maybe Patricia would have laughed the loudest. But something had changed inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I wasn't trying to win approval. I wasn't trying to prove myself to my wife's family. I was doing something for me. The next morning I started researching programs, requirements, costs, timelines. Every free minute became dedicated to learning. I worked during the day, studied at night, then studied again before work. My friends thought I was losing my mind. Some were supportive, others weren't. One guy actually laughed when I told him my plan. "You want to become a doctor now? At your age?" He wasn't trying to be cruel, just realistic. At least that was what he claimed. I smiled, then went back to studying. Months became a year, then another. Life became brutally difficult. There were nights I fell asleep over textbooks, mornings when I woke up with pages stuck to my face. Weekends disappeared, vacations disappeared, dating disappeared. Everything disappeared. Only the goal remained. Money became another challenge. Medical education wasn't cheap. I sold things, worked extra shifts, took freelance work, accepted projects nobody else wanted. Some months I barely had enough for myself. More than once I questioned whether I was making a terrible mistake. But every time doubt appeared, I remembered that dining room. I remembered Patricia's voice. Hilda broke. The words no longer hurt. They fueled me. Not because I wanted revenge, because I refused to let someone else's opinion define my future. Years passed. Slowly, painfully, but progress came. One exam at a time. One semester at a time. One sacrifice at a time. The impossible started becoming possible. Then one afternoon everything changed. I received a letter, an acceptance letter. I had officially entered the next stage of my medical journey. I sat alone in my apartment holding that letter, reading it over and over, unable to believe it. Nobody celebrated with me. Nobody threw a party. Nobody bought champagne. But it was one of the happiest days of my life, because I had earned it. Every single piece of it. The years that followed were even harder. Training, clinical rotations, long shifts, sleepless nights, emergency cases, endless studying. There were moments I thought I might break, moments I wanted to quit, moments I wondered if normal people lived easier lives. But each challenge strengthened me, each setback sharpened me, each obstacle transformed me. By the time I finished my training, I was no longer the same man who had walked out of Patricia's dining room. That version of me had disappeared. In his place stood someone stronger, someone calmer, someone who no longer needed permission to believe in himself. Then opportunity arrived. A respected physician nearing retirement wanted to sell his private practice. Most people thought I couldn't afford it. Maybe they were right, at least at first. But I had spent years building relationships, saving money, creating opportunities. After months of negotiations and planning, the deal happened. The day I received the keys, I stood alone inside the building. The clinic was beautiful, modern, professional, elegant. Floor-to-ceiling windows, private consultation rooms, state-of-the-art equipment. A reception area that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a medical office. For several minutes I simply stood there, looking around, remembering where I had started, remembering the apartment, remembering the insults, remembering the silence. A year later, the clinic was thriving. Patients trusted us. The staff was incredible. Appointments were booked weeks in advance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surviving. I was building. One Tuesday morning, I arrived early. The sun had barely risen. Everything seemed normal. I reviewed patient charts, answered messages, prepared for consultations. Nothing unusual. Then around 10 o'clock, there was a knock on my office door. My receptionist stepped inside. Normally she was calm, professional, unshakable. This time she looked nervous, confused, almost stunned. I immediately knew something was different. She hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke. "Doctor." I looked up. "There are two women in the waiting room asking specifically for you." I frowned. That wasn't unusual. Patients requested me all the time, but something about her expression felt strange. "Who are they?" She swallowed, then handed me the intake forms. The moment I read the names, my heart stopped. Angela Bennett, Patricia Bennett. After all these years, they were sitting in my waiting room. For a few seconds I simply stared at the intake forms. Angela Bennett, Patricia Bennett. The names felt strangely familiar and distant at the same time, like something from another life, a life I had spent years trying to leave behind. My receptionist shifted nervously. "Doctor, are you okay?" I looked up. For a moment I considered asking another physician to handle the case. It would have been easier, safer, less complicated. But then I remembered something. I had learned during the hardest years of my journey. Growth means facing the things that once had power over you, calmly, without fear, without resentment. I stood from my desk, straightened my coat, and walked toward the waiting room. The hallway seemed longer than usual. Each step brought back memories. The apartment, the argument, the family dinners, the humiliation, the night I walked away. Yet surprisingly, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel satisfaction. Mostly I felt curiosity. I pushed open the door. The waiting room was quiet. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Several patients sat reading magazines. Others looked at their phones. Then I saw them. Angela and Patricia. Time seemed to stop. Patricia was the first to notice me. Her eyes lifted from the paperwork in her lap. The moment she recognized me, her face went pale, completely pale. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The confident woman who had once controlled every room she entered suddenly looked lost. Then Angela looked up. Her reaction was even stronger. She froze. Her eyes widened. Disbelief washed across her face. For several seconds, neither woman moved. Neither woman spoke. They simply stared, as if they couldn't trust what they were seeing. And honestly, I understood why. The last time they had seen me, I was struggling, working long hours, driving an old car, trying desperately to earn approval that was never going to come. Now, I stood before them wearing a white coat with my name embroidered across the chest. The owner of the clinic, the physician responsible for their care. Life had a strange sense of humor. I walked toward them calmly, professional, controlled. Years of training had taught me how to hide emotion. "Good morning." My voice broke the silence. Angela blinked several times, as if waking from a dream. "Nathan." I nodded. "It's good to see you, Angela." Patricia looked like she couldn't breathe. Her hands tightened around her handbag. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed completely unsure of herself. "You..." She stopped. Tried again. You work here? A few nearby patients glanced in our direction. I smiled politely. I do. Neither woman spoke. The silence stretched between us. Karma. Finally, Angela looked around the luxurious waiting room, the reception desk, the marble floors, the modern equipment visible through the glass walls. Then she looked back at me. Realization slowly appeared in her eyes. This is your clinic? I nodded again. Yes. The shock on her face deepened. I could almost see the memories moving through her mind. The comments, the insults, the predictions, the certainty that I would never become anything important. Patricia swallowed hard. For years she had spoken with complete confidence about my future. Now she was sitting inside evidence that she had been completely wrong. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. My receptionist approached carefully. Doctor, should I prepare room 3? I turned toward her. Yes, please. Then I looked back at my former mother-in-law. Mrs. Bennett, I'll be reviewing your case personally. For a moment she couldn't answer. Eventually she managed a small nod. Thank you. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from her, almost uncomfortable. I escorted them toward a private consultation room. The same woman who once criticized every aspect of my life now followed me quietly through my clinic. Neither of us mentioned it. Not yet. Inside the consultation room I reviewed her file. Several test results immediately caught my attention. My expression became serious. The condition wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to require specialized treatment. Without proper care, it could become much worse. I explained everything carefully, professionally, the way I would explain it to any patient. Patricia listened closely. Angela sat beside her. Neither interrupted. Neither questioned my expertise. That alone felt surreal. When I finished speaking, the room became quiet again. Patricia looked down at her hands. For years I had only seen confidence from her. Sometimes arrogance. Sometimes superiority. Never vulnerability. Now vulnerability was all I could see. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Less certain. Finally she spoke. Nathan. It was the first time. I could remember her saying my name without criticism attached to it. I waited. She struggled to meet my eyes. Then she asked softly, How long have you been a doctor? Several years. She nodded slowly. I didn't know. I know. A painful silence followed. Angela stared at the floor. Patricia stared at the table. Nobody seemed willing to say what all three of us were thinking. Eventually Angela broke. Tears appeared in her eyes. You really did it. I looked at her. What do you mean? She laughed sadly. All those years ago, you always talked about becoming more, building something, creating a better future. Her voice cracked. And you actually did it. For a moment I didn't know how to respond, because the truth was simple. I hadn't done it to impress them. I hadn't done it to prove them wrong. I had done it because, one day, I finally realized my worth didn't depend on anyone else's opinion. Patricia suddenly wiped at her eyes. The movement surprised me. I had never seen her cry before. Not once. She looked directly at me. The confidence was gone. The pride was gone. Only honesty remained. And for the first time in our entire relationship, she looked genuinely afraid. Afraid of her diagnosis. Afraid of uncertainty. Afraid of needing help from the very man she once dismissed. Her voice trembled slightly. Nathan. I waited. She took a deep breath, then asked the question neither of us ever imagined she would ask. Can you really help me? For a few seconds I simply looked at her. The woman who had once predicted my failure. The woman who had looked across a crowded dining room and declared that I would die broke. Now she was sitting across from me asking for help. Not because she wanted to, because she needed to. Life has a way of humbling all of us eventually. The question hanging in the room wasn't really about medicine. It was about something much deeper. Could I help someone who had hurt me? Could I treat someone fairly after everything that had happened? Could I remain the man I had worked so hard to become? I closed her file and nodded. Yes. The relief on Patricia's face was immediate, almost overwhelming. For the first time that day, tears rolled down her cheeks. Not dramatic tears, quiet tears. The kind that appear when someone has been carrying fear for a long time. I leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Bennett, you're my patient. My responsibility is to help you. That's exactly what I'm going to do. She lowered her head, unable to speak. Angela covered her mouth as fresh tears appeared in her eyes. I spent the next several weeks overseeing Patricia's treatment. Every appointment was professional. Every conversation was respectful. Every decision was based on what was best for her health. The staff never knew the history between us. To them, she was simply another patient. And that was exactly how I treated her. At first, Patricia seemed uncomfortable, almost suspicious, as though she expected revenge, as though she expected me to embarrass her the way she had embarrassed me. But revenge never came. Instead, she received compassion, the same compassion she had once denied me. One afternoon after a successful procedure, she asked if she could speak with me privately. I agreed. We sat in my office. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she looked around the room. The diplomas, the certificates, the awards, the framed photographs, evidence of years of sacrifice, years she knew nothing about. Finally, she spoke. I was wrong. The words came out quietly, painfully. I was wrong about you. I remained silent. She continued. I judged you by what you had. I never bothered to look at who you were. Another tear slid down her face. I thought money meant character. I thought success belonged only to certain people. I thought I knew how the world worked. She shook her head slowly. And I couldn't have been more wrong. I listened carefully, not because I needed the apology. Because I could see how difficult it was for her to say it. Real accountability is rare. Most people would rather protect their pride than face the truth. Patricia was finally facing hers. A few days later, Angela asked if we could talk alone. Part of me didn't want to, but another part knew the conversation was necessary. We met after clinic hours. The building was quiet. The last patients had gone home. Sunlight painted the city in shades of gold. Angela looked nervous. Far more nervous than I had ever seen her. For a long moment, she simply stared at me. Then she said something I never expected to hear. My biggest mistake wasn't my mother. I waited. Her eyes filled with tears. My biggest mistake was my silence. The words hit harder than I expected. Because they were true. She wasn't responsible for Patricia's actions. She was responsible for her own. And for years she had chosen comfort over courage. She had chosen peace over truth. She had chosen silence over loyalty. I kept telling myself I was avoiding conflict. She laughed bitterly. But I wasn't. I was avoiding responsibility. She wiped her eyes. Every time you needed me to stand beside you, I failed. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then I nodded. Because there was nothing else to say. The truth had finally arrived. Years late. But it had arrived. As Patricia's treatment progressed, her health improved dramatically. The fear that had once dominated her face slowly disappeared. Strength returned. Energy returned. Hope returned. One afternoon she walked into my office smiling. A genuine smile. Not the kind she used years ago. Not the smile of superiority. The smile of gratitude. The smile of someone who had learned an important lesson. She sat down and looked directly at me. Nathan. I smiled. How are you feeling? Better than I have in months. I nodded. Good. She hesitated, then spoke. I spent most of my life believing success gave people value. Her eyes moved toward the window. But sitting in this clinic taught me something. I remained quiet. She continued. Character gives people value. Success only reveals it. Those words stayed with me. Because they were true. Money does not create kindness. It reveals it. Power does not create integrity. It reveals it. Success does not create character. It exposes the character that was already there. Weeks later, Patricia completed her treatment. The results were excellent. Her prognosis was strong. The day she received the final report, she cried again, this time from relief. Before leaving, she hugged me. The gesture surprised both of us. Then she whispered something I will never forget. Thank you for being a better person than I was. I watched her leave with Angela. For a moment, I stood alone in the hallway, thinking, reflecting, remembering. The old version of me would have dreamed about that moment, dreamed about proving everyone wrong, dreamed about making them regret everything. But standing there, I realized something important. The greatest victory is not making people regret losing you. The greatest victory is becoming someone who no longer needs their approval. A week later, Angela returned alone. She wanted closure. Nothing more, nothing less. We talked for nearly an hour. We remembered the good years, acknowledged the painful ones, accepted reality. At one point, she looked at me and smiled sadly. You became everything they said you never would. I shook my head. No. She looked confused. I smiled. I became everything I always could have been. There is a difference. Potential already exists inside us. The world doesn't give it to us. Karma. Other people don't create it. We simply decide whether we are willing to develop it. When Angela finally stood to leave, she paused at the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she nodded. A silent acknowledgement of everything that had happened. Everything that had been lost. Everything that had been learned. And then she walked away. The chapter was over. Not with anger. Not with revenge. But with understanding. Today, when people ask about success, I tell them something simple. Success is not the best revenge. Growth is. Because revenge keeps your attention on the people who hurt you. Growth keeps your attention on the person you are becoming. The truth is that Patricia's insult changed my life. Not because she was right. Because she was wrong. And because one day, I finally stopped trying to convince other people of my value. The moment I stopped chasing validation was the moment my real life began. If there is one lesson in my story, it is this. Never allow someone else's opinion to become your identity. People judge your current situation and assume they know your future. They see your struggle and mistake it for your destination. They see your beginning and think they understand your ending. They don't. None of us know what another person may become. The man they laugh at today may be leading tomorrow. The woman they underestimate today may be inspiring thousands tomorrow. Potential is invisible.